Okay, I think we can go ahead and get things started here. So, some of you may know that. So before I start, I just want to give a little caveat. I haven't been live streaming a lot lately because, like, signals and Wi-Fi, it's not, things aren't going well. So, if during this things don't go well, it keeps, cutting in and out and things like that, I might just reschedule probably for tomorrow when I can get downstairs and actually in the room where we have our router, modem, whatever that thing is called. So I just wanted to let everybody know that. So, and that's also the reason why you haven't seen a lot of live streams out of my channel. It's because it just gets annoying trying to deal with connection issues, even though I have a laptop telling me, hey, connection's good, everything's good. And StreamYard is like, no, everything's terrible. Your connection is terrible. I don't know what the issue is. I think it's probably because StreamYard is an in-browser streaming service, and those, from what I've heard, don't run as smoothly as, like, the applications that you can download, things like OBS and stuff like that, Streamlabs. So if things don't go well, let me know if I start cutting in and out or anything. But I was recently on Capturing Christianity's channel. That was yesterday, along with some other people that I know. And Frank Turek was on, and so Capturing Christianity's been doing some live call-in shows, doing some fundraising to help get his revenue streams back up where they need to be so he can continue doing what he's doing. So I called in and I just presented the argument from evil to Frank. Just I've never really seen him interact with it like deeply, and so I was hoping to have a quick moment to hopefully interact with him here, present the argument, see what he has to say, and I presented it. And well, I just won't. I just won't say anything. We can jump into this and we can review what went on, because there were a few things that video. I don't want extra camera shares. There we go. There were a few things that I didn't really get to respond to, or at least not nearly as thoroughly as I wanted to. There were things that I didn't get to explain as well as I wanted to explain. So I wanted to take the time here to review this video and kind of explain things and maybe provide responses where I didn't really get to provide responses actually in the while I was there. So again, if anything starts cutting out, roboting, please let me know. I hope it doesn't. Doesn't seem like it has yet. But let's first go full screen and then we can jump on into this.
So let's pull in Leo. Is that correct? And Leo, what is how do you pronounce your full name? Oh, you muted yourself? Okay. Yeah, I asked them to unmute, but I have it to where they can't unmute themselves unless I ask them to. So Leo, is it Leophilus? Is that how to?
Leophilius.
Leophilius. Okay. Is that your real
Greek
name, or is that just like
lions. No.
Okay.
No, it's just a YouTube moniker.
Okay. I've seen your stuff like every now and then, but I haven't watched, I don't think like a full video or full debate. I know that you do debates. But yeah, maybe just give us a little bit of your background before we get to your question.
Yeah, I have a small channel where I just talk about topics usually in physics and philosophy. I do a little bit of politics stuff, but those are the areas that I find most interesting, particularly cosmology and quantum mechanics. And then, I don't know, I really like metaphysics. I don't know why, but metaphysics really just kind of, it tickles me a little bit. That and philosophy of science, I should add that one.
Okay. So yeah, what's your question? And try to be nice, because we've been going for a while. We're both a little bit exhausted here. So
well, so what I really wanted to do was present an argument, present the logical argument from evil to Frank, and just kind of see how he responds to it, if I may.
Sure.
Sure, go ahead, man.
So I'm going to give it in syllogistic form just to make it, really easy to engage with. Premise one: if God exists, then there are no pro-toto evils. And by pro-toto evils, what I mean is things that are evil, all things considered. Premise two is there are pro-toto evils, and so the conclusion would be, therefore, God does not exist.
Okay, again, I would argue that.
So I just want to pause it here just to sort of say this again. So the argument is premise one: if God exists, there are no pro-toto evils. Premise two: there are pro-toto evils. Conclusion: therefore, God does not exist. And by God, I just mean, at minimum, a personal entity, something possessing personhood that is all-powerful and morally perfect. If you want to add extra stuff onto that, that's fine. That's good. Great. But at least this entity is all-powerful and morally perfect. And then by pro-toto evil, all I mean here are things that are evil, all things considered. And really what I mean there is just to say that when you consider all of the relevant facts to the situation at hand, there isn't anything that justifies the action as something that ought to occur, all things considered. When you consider all of those relevant facts, this is something that should not happen, all things considered. And that's what that all things considered means there. So that's what I mean by pro-toto, is an all things considered evil. Something that is evil even when you've considered all of the relevant facts to that situation. That way you guys, excuse me, that way you guys are up to speed with how I'm using these terms.
that there's no such thing as evil unless there's good, and there's no such thing as good unless God exists. So the argument presupposes that God exists, doesn't nullify God existing.
Well, okay. Didn't want to do that. But there we go. It seems to me that that seems to be begging the question against the argument. And it is to say, oh, well, but like what goodness is depends on God. So you can't talk about goodness unless you're presupposing God exists, is effectively begging the question against the argument. No, I'll mention it later because it comes up in the discussion.
Well, the question is, how do you define evil?
I would define evil as those things which ought not to occur or ought not to be permitted, all things considered.
Okay, well, now when you're in the realm of ought nots, there has to be someone who has decided what ought to be. So who is that?
God. This is an internal critique. So the argument grants that God exists and is the ground of morality.
Oh, okay. Well, then, so the question run through again, are you saying essentially that I thought the conclusion of the argument was that God doesn't exist?
That's correct.
Well, then how can the argument assume God does exist to say he doesn't exist?
Because it's an internal critique. It's using the worldview of Christianity to draw internal contradictions that would otherwise falsify the ideology.
So, okay, so essentially you're saying that if we're assuming God exists, and I'm sorry, I'm tired, Leo. We've been doing this for almost 3 hours.
No,
but
it's all good.
Yeah, you're assuming that God exists in order to say that there is a standard of goodness or rightness out there or morality out there. But there are things that occur in the world that don't meet that standard. And if God existed, he would prevent those things from happening. Therefore, this God doesn't exist.
You could say prevent from happening. That's not like a wrong way to put it, but I would say that they would just be unpermitted by God. That God's moral perfection mandates that he seeks what's best. And if so I would say a better world would be one where the Holocaust didn't happen. And so if that's a better world, and by God's moral perfection, he necessarily seeks what's best, then it seems that that would be the world that God would have instantiated, is one where something like the Holocaust does not happen. But we observe a Holocaust. So that seems to suggest that a God, at least one that is both all-powerful and morally perfect, it does not exist.
Right. The problem with that is that it assumes that there can't be any goodness that comes from these so-called awful events. And we don't know that. There's no way we could know that, because and we've already kind of covered this, if it's the same objection, probably in the first or second question we had, that there's this enormous ripple effect for every event that occurs. I mean, we can even just think in our own lives, right? In order for us to even exist here right now, our parents had to meet, their parents had to meet, their parents had to meet. I mean, all these ripples that have occurred for us to even exist. And we can't foresee what happens when these things do exist. And so we could see an awful event, like say a baby dying, and we go, why did the baby die? Right? I mean, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Oh, okay, yeah, it's a fallen world, but why did this baby die? I don't know, but I know why I don't know. I'm finite. I'm inside of time. I can't see the end from the beginning. But if there is a God, he's outside of time, and he can see that perhaps this baby dying today at least partially ripples forward to bring forth a great evangelist that saves millions of people 500 years from now. I can't trace those ripples.
Okay, so what Frank is doing here is it's worded a little differently. Perhaps it's skeptical theism adjacent, but he's effectively presenting a sort of a skeptical theism theodicy here, where, look, I don't know why all these seemingly bad things happen, but I know why I don't know why, and it's because I am a limited being. But see, however, God is not a limited being, so he knows, the good reasons that will come, sort of like a ripple effect. A bad thing happens, but then, maybe a bunch of really good things happen because of it. It's similar to a skeptical theism that he's presenting here. And then I move to try to respond to that.
Leo, would you say that that's a denial of premise 2? Just to kind of remind the audience that the premise 1 is if God exists, there are no pro-toto evils. Premise 2, there are pro-toto evils. Sounds like he's denying premise 2 here.
I think I would put it in that category. It seems to me that he's saying that, well, these evils that occur might actually conduce much greater goods. And we don't know that because we're finite beings. God is not finite. So he would know that. And that's what justifies his permission of that evil event. Is that right, Frank?
Yes. And I would also add the fact that we're dealing not just with time, but with eternity. And this is why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, that we keep our eyes not on just what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, what is unseen is eternal. So we're not just dealing, I agree with you, if we're talking about just time, there are so many things that happen in this world that justice never appears to come. But if there is another world where justice can come, and by the way, the only being that can bring justice is a being that himself is the standard of justice and has the knowledge and power to right all wrongs in the end. And the only being that could do that would be a God like the God of the Bible.
Okay, so my response to that would be really just to ask, is it possible that God could have achieved those greater goods without the permission of the evil event? See, the point here that's being made is that first, we really need to understand what is meant by something being good and something being evil. And it's really not super hard. Things that are good are the things that we think should happen or that should be permitted. They're these things that we would say ought to occur, all things considered. The things that we want to happen or we want to see obtain in the world. And then evil would be the things that we don't want to happen, the things that ought not occur or be permitted, all things considered. And so when we understand that, the problem here is that when God seeks to allow things in the world, if he's morally perfect, he's seeking what's going to be best. And so if there are things that are greater goods that need some sort of like evil event to happen, then that evil event just isn't evil. If it's the only way that we can get to that greater good, the greater good being something which ought to occur, all things considered, and this event is the only way to get to it, then it follows that that event also ought to occur in virtue of the fact that we have this greater good that it conduces that ought to occur. And the only way to conduce that greater good is through this means here that might otherwise be perceived as evil. Then it just follows that it's not actually evil because in virtue of the greater good it ought to occur. And so this idea of God permitting evils to occur for a greater good doesn't really make a lot of sense. Those evils would just themselves be good.
Well, I suppose it's possible, but we don't know if it is.
And so what this means is that if God has justifying reasons for permitting evils, then those evils really aren't evil.
Right.
Would that be better? Would it be better to allow for those greater goods without having to have an evil event come before it?
Well, I see the problem. Yeah, the problem is, as I mentioned.
Also, if you can get to those greater goods without having to go through this otherwise evil thing, then that would be better than getting to that greater good through the evil thing. And so God would just do that instead. And so if there's some way we can get to a greater good that doesn't involve something that would otherwise be considered evil, then we would just do it that way. God would just do it that way. So no matter which way you slice it, if you're taking a view like that, then it follows that there really are no evils in the world. There are no all things considered or pro-toto evils. And so you would just be rejecting premise 2, and that's fine. All you're claiming is that this is the best of all possible worlds. There is no evil, there is no sin, but then what follows from that is an inconsistency in Christianity with the whole Jesus thing. And I point that out a little later in the discussion.
Mentioned earlier, could this be a better world? Of course it could be. One less rape, one less murder, be a better world, right? And this is not the best possible world, but it might be the best possible way to get to the best possible world with free creatures. Because what God can't do is force free creatures to do what he wants them to do, because then they wouldn't be free.
Yeah,
So any world God creates, he's going to create a world, if he creates a world with free creatures, where people are going to rebel, where evil's going to be done. And so he creates this world, but then redeems it.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I covered this like 2 hours ago. So
yeah, I heard a little bit of that. Are you saying that the existence of free will necessitates the existence of evil? Because I don't personally think that's true. No, I think it's entirely possible to have a world with rational moral agents such as ourselves, where they all possess free will in the libertarian sense, yet none of them ever choose freely to do evil. And it seems to me that such a world would be better than this one. And if God's morally perfect, he always seeks what's best. And if he's all powerful, he can actualize what's best, assuming it's logically consistent, and I think this is. And so it just seems to me that it would follow, particularly from God's perfect rationality, that he would just create such a world where we all have free will in the libertarian sense, and we all freely choose to never do evil, because there is no logical contradiction there. And so it's a logically consistent state of affairs. Yeah. So that's effectively the contradiction that the argument from evil makes, is this idea that if you have a being that is all powerful, morally perfect, and perfectly rational, if it's morally perfect, it always seeks what's best. It always wants what's best. If it's all powerful, it has the ability to manifest that. And if it's perfectly rational, it seeks to manifest its desires. And so then it just follows that whatever God does, whatever God allows, or whatever God permits as defined is what's best. But it does not seem that our world truly is what's best. Christians say that as Frank has, that our world is not what's best. Well, then it seems that you either have to reject that God is all powerful, God is morally perfect, or that God is perfectly rational, which puts the Christian or even the Muslim, kind of back in a position they don't want to be, or you have to reject the existence of such a being altogether. Or you would have to claim that we do live in the best possible world, which I think would be very hard to defend, particularly for Christians who have the whole Jesus thing. And so you can sort of see why this is such a huge problem for religions like Christianity and even Islam, which you can run the logical argument of evil against. And so right there was really sort of me really simply laying out what it is that the contradiction is that's in Christianity.
Yeah.
By the way, I really hope everything is coming through clear enough, because StreamYard is trying to tell me that my connection is a bit unstable. My laptop's telling me it's not. It's fine. So hopefully things are coming through relatively clear.
Logically possible is not always actually achievable, though, right? It's logically possible that you and I could both have the money of Elon Musk.
It's also logically possible that we could achieve having the money of Elon Musk. So this is where he gets into the notion of achievability. I'm going to let him go a little bit here, though.
But it's not actually achievable, okay?
But it seems that if God is omnipotent, he can actualize. So he's saying just because something is logically possible doesn't mean that it's achievable. Now, as I understand logic, and I by no means am a logician of any sort, but that seems just intuitively wrong. To say that something is achievable does not mean that you can or will achieve it, just that there exists a possibility to achieve it, which seems to me to be the same thing as saying that something is logically possible, that it can in principle obtain or be the case, so to speak. So it seems to me that to say that something is logically possible is to say that it is at least in principle achievable. And if God is all powerful, well, then he can achieve anything as long as it's logically consistent, as is the situation that I outlined with a world where you have agents with libertarian free will, and they always freely choose to do what's good. actualize any logically consistent state of affairs. So all of them would be achievable for God, but he may just choose to actualize certain ones over others for whatever reasons that he may have. And so,
no,
okay,
because
that didn't pause. There we go. So what I'm effectively saying here is that I'm granting him that there could be things that are logically possible but not achievable, but that wouldn't be the case for an omnipotent being. Anything that's what omnipotence would mean, essentially, is that anything that is logically possible for this being is in fact achievable in virtue of its all-powerfulness. So I don't know where bringing achievability in here is helping Frank at all.
With free creatures, God can't force them to do what he wants. So
he doesn't in this world. And that's the thing. In this world, all rational moral agents freely choose, in the libertarian sense, to never do evil.
Right, but maybe that world isn't actually achievable with free creatures. At least a world where people...
If it's logically possible, then for God, it would be achievable.
People don't go through this intermediate state where they have to make a choice and learn from the great difficulties and troubles that come with disobedience. Once they go through this, then they have accepted the redemption that Christ provides, and then they go to a world where we tried that before, we know that's not going to work, and they have been redeemed and their sin nature has been obliterated.
Well, Frank, is that the only theodicy that you forward, free will, or do you have other theodicies that you appeal to?
Well, that's the primary one I use.
Okay.
What other? I mean, there is a satanic theosity, right? That you could have. Well, there's evil forces in the world that bring about some of this. I mean, that's part of it. I didn't mention it.
Yeah. Soul building is one of my favorites, and I think that does maybe.
Yeah, soul building is the theodicy that Cameron prefers. Where, like, well, first off, Cameron, I think, largely hashes this out in terms of suffering rather than evil, and I don't consider those to be synonymous with one another. But that there's a lot that the suffering that exists in the world exists as a means of like building character and, you know, giving people the opportunity to act in good ways. But you can't really have that if you don't have like evil, like stopping somebody from stealing an old woman's purse. You know, that would be virtuous, and the expression of something that's virtuous like that unfortunately can't exist without the evil of trying to steal an old woman's purse. And while I'm willing to grant that this may be a better world than other worlds, I don't think it's the best world, which would be one where there simply is no evil in the first place. I don't think evil existing to allow for people to act, say, goodly, just kind of making up words here, necessarily means that that world is better than a world where there simply is no evil to begin with.
Address your question a little bit better, Leo, because it some of those do entail suffering, like courage, sacrifice, forgiveness. Like a lot of these moral properties, like literally entail or require and necessitate.
I should specify that as I present it, I refer specifically to evil and not suffering, because I don't consider those to be synonymous with one another.
Leo,
so I'm just referring to anything that oughtn't occur, all things considered.
Maybe this question is out of bounds, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But I sense that something personal has happened to you has been very painful.
This is, and I'm going to skip through it because it's just him pulling the whole "who hurt you" kind of argument. But this is, quite frankly, an obvious pivot on Frank's part, that he's engaging with an argument. He's kind of, struggling to follow along. So he pivots to the, "Oh God, Leo, who hurt you" argument. And I'm not trying to like insult Frank when I say this or anything, but this is quite obviously just sort of an emotional based pivot.
Just you answers that I'm given are they're difficult to reconcile
my life, but for the most part, I think that I've Oh, I've definitely gone through some painful events in my life, but for the most part, I think that I've evolved past those. I did want to respond to this and see, notice how I handled that. I didn't really acknowledge much of what he said. I just sort of dismissed it and then continued on with the argumentation. What I really wanted to do, I was trying to be as like non-confrontational yet still firm as I possibly could, because I knew the minute, since Cameron, seemingly knows who I am, had I like actually gone full Leo on Frank, I probably would have just been like kicked off the program. I didn't want that. But what I did is sort of dismiss his pivot and then bring the discussion right back to what we were talking about. The statement that you made before Cameron had mentioned soul building about this achievability, because it seems to me so.
Actually,
and maybe
sorry,
you
Leo.
disagree with this, Frank. What's
If
up?
you don't mind, we've been going a while, so I'd like to actually maybe ask you a question really.
So I go to continue to press Frank on the argument, and this was when I was going to get into the whole achievability kind of entails logical possibility and vice versa, particularly with an omnipotent being. I was going to start to break that idea down, get into that, and show how that's not really an objection to the argument. And I'm cut off. Just pointing that out for everybody.
Really quickly, get your thoughts on it,
Sure.
and then I think we do need to kind of close it out because, as I said, we've been going a while.
Right on.
The question is, what are your thoughts on skeptical theism as a sort of undercutting defeater for? You don't really give a defensive premise to. You just mentioned the syllogism. So
also, mind you, that when I presented the argument. This is how you do it. In philosophy, you present the argument. Notice how neither one of them, right after I presented the initial argument, said, "So, would you be willing? Can I get you to defend, premise one or premise two? Can I? What's the argument for that?" Not a single one of them did that. Not a single one. So look, I am not afraid to give arguments or defenses for my premises, but I'm not going to do it unless you ask me. Because if you don't ask me, then I'm assuming that like you're at least like tacitly granting the premises, kind of maybe to see just where the argument goes or something like that. But like if you want to challenge my premises, say it. And like if I were Frank, that's the first thing I would have done. I would have said, "So you're saying in premise one is if God exists, then there are no pro-total evils." I don't know if I would be willing to just grant that. Can you give an argument for that premise? That's what I would have done. And then that puts the defense back onto me rather than Frank. But Frank didn't do that. Cameron didn't do that either. That's not really my fault. If you don't ask me for the argument for a premise, I'm probably not going to give it.
So how would you think, or how do you see skeptical theism interacting with your second premise there?
So the way that I view skeptical theism is this idea that there are evil events that occur in the world, and God may have justifying reasons for the permission of those events that we, being finite beings, clearly don't have access to. And so from our perspective, these events seem evil. But this just seems to be saying that they seem evil. They're not actually evil, all things considered, in virtue of God's justifying reasons. That's sort of, at least when we talk about morality, what justification does. If I told you that I walked into a school and shot a man, you would freak out. But if I told you that man had already killed 15 students and 4 teachers, that justifies the action. It makes that action go from something I ought not to have done to something that I ought to have done. And that's just what I take goodness to be, things which ought to occur, all things considered. So it seems that under skeptical theism, in virtue of God's justifications, these events that we would otherwise consider evil ought to occur, all things considered. And then that's why God permits them. And at that point, then they're just not pro-toto evil. So I'm explaining sort of the concept of justification here, as I'm sure the rest of you are capable of following. My audience isn't stupid. But this is something that I believe Cameron actually later denies, is that at least within the framework of morality, when we talk about something being morally justified, what we mean is that, like, generally speaking, this is something you ought not do, all things considered, but in virtue of some sort of like external reason, you ought to have done it. Like in that instance of the sort of the school shooting kind of example that I gave there. I ought not go into a school and shoot a man. But if that man is somebody who's already killed a number of students and faculty, at least most people are going to say, I ought to have, shot that man. So that's what moral justification means. And in that instance, if God has morally justifying reasons, even if we don't have access to them, for the permission of these evils, then at least all things considered, they're not evil. And so then at that point, what it means is just that all things considered, there really is no evil in the world. And then again, you can bring up the whole, so if there is no evil, then there's no sin. And then, I mean, what was the Jesus bit all about? That seems to be kind of superfluous at that point. And I'll just leave it there and continue for a little bit, because this gets just a little thick.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused.
And then I would
about...
take at that point that there's no evil in the world. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused about that part. So I think that just because if some evil has some sort of justifying reason for it, so like when I take my daughter to go get a shot, for example, I still think that it's evil, the pain that she experiences. Okay, just because it's got like a justifying reason. So I guess that's kind of like where my hangup is on your view here, is that I think that there are evils in the world, but that doesn't mean that if there is a justifying reason for that evil, that the overall situation is not evil. Like, I think that it would have components of evil, components of good, but then the question would be, what is the overall value of that world? Which is a separate question from whether or not there's some sort of pro-total evil, or like just because there's a justifying evil, then that means, or a justifying good, that means that there is no evil. Yeah, help me out here, because I think that there can be evil and good.
Yeah, there's still evil.
So I feel like, and later on, Cameron multiple times accuses me of confusing or conflating axiology and deontology. I never pushed back on that because I'm just going to be honest, I had no fucking clue what he meant by that. He tried to explain it. His explanation didn't sound good. I genuinely, even now, I don't really know what he meant by saying that. I feel like it was kind of just an objection for the sake of being an objection. But what the hell was I gonna say? Oh yeah, it seems to me, and I could be wrong on this, I'm not saying that this is their view, but it seems to me that both Cameron and Frank take this view that wrongness and goodness are properties of actions and behaviors. So like, you could say that if you murder somebody, if you kill somebody, if you take somebody's life, there's this property called wrongness that is built into that action. And as I understand it, and I just may be off base here, but as I understand it, that's what deontology is this idea that the wrongness or rightness is sort of like an intrinsic property of the action itself. It's not something, sort of ascribed to it. And I just reject that. I don't think, first off, I don't think that the concept of moral properties really makes sense. I would say something more like moral prescriptions myself, but I don't think that there are that these things are properties in any sense of the word myself. Other people may disagree, that's fine. But for myself, I don't think that there are such things as moral properties. I think that that morals are largely given in terms of our norms. Ought something be done, all things considered, then it's good. If something ought not be done, all things considered, then it's evil, it's bad, it's wrong. So I don't know how something could be something which ought to occur and ought not to occur simultaneously. Like the same thing ought to occur and ought not to occur simultaneously. That makes no sense to me. So something's either good or it's evil. There can't be something that's evil, but it's justified. Because in virtue of the justification, that just means that, again, in virtue of the justification, it ought to have occurred. And then that just makes it good. So maybe Cameron, and he likely does have a very different view on this, given that he is a Christian. But that's the way that a lot of, as I understand it, a lot of moral philosophers cash things out, is in terms of norms and oughts. And what ought and what ought not to be done. But maybe maybe I'm off base here. I don't know. I don't think I am, but who knows?
Still evil acts, even if good comes from them, they're still evil acts.
Yeah, this idea that if something's good or if something's evil, but it produces a good, the evil thing is still evil. But that doesn't make sense because, as I explained earlier in the stream, you might have something that let's say is a greater good. An example I often get is a woman is violated, and that's wrong. Obviously, that is very wrong. But what results from her being violated is that she starts this charity organization to help aid other women and men who have been violated and help to educate people to prevent this from happening. And she, the organization does a really good job. Say it saves hundreds of thousands of women from potential torment, potential violation, which is a greater good. Now, there's two ways we can look at this. Either this organization and this woman's movement to change the world, which is the greater good, happens only in virtue of her being violated, or it could happen through some other means that does not include her violation. Now, if that's the case, God would want to permit that means because it's better than the one where she is violated in order to bring this greater good about. However, if it's the case that this greater good only comes about in virtue of her being violated, and we actively desire that greater good, it ought to occur, all things considered, then it follows that the violation, which is the only way to get this greater good, ought to have occurred as well. And so this idea that something could be evil yet bring about some greater good, but even in virtue of it bringing about the greater good, it's still evil, makes no sense unless there's another way to bring about that greater good that doesn't involve an evil action. In which case, why did God not bring that about? So I take a normative view with respect to what good and evil are. That's where that ought comes from, that what is good is just the things that we ought to occur, all things considered, the things that we ought to permit, all things considered, and then just ought not with things that are evil. And so in the instance where, at least currently with our technology, maybe not for all immunizations, but I know for most, we can't really administer them without that associated uncomfortability or pain with the injection. And so since that's the case and we ought to get vaccinated, then it would just follow that we ought to endure the pain of that, since there's no way to disconnect them. And if there's this greater good, and everything that I just got done explaining is what I'm trying to explain here, that if you cannot get an immunization or a vaccination without some minor associated pain, then it just follows that you ought to endure the pain in virtue of the fact that you ought to get the immunization, and you can't get the immunization without the pain. Like it's sort of, it almost logically follows. I'm not going to say that. I'm not saying that. But it's like, I don't know. I struggle to understand how they're struggling to understand this. I don't know. Maybe it's confusing. Maybe people in the chat don't understand it. Let me know that this comes along with, say, vaccinating, which is the greater good, and this pain that comes with the needle going through your skin that rides along with it. If you can't disconnect that latter from the former, from the greater good, then it follows that that latter ought to occur, since it's the only way to conduce that greater good. And if the greater good
but now
ought
it
to
seems
occur,
like
and this is the only way, then this ought to occur as well.
it seems to me like you're now conflating axiology and deontology. Is that the right term? Yeah, you're
See, somebody help me out. What does he mean? I asked him, and he didn't really give much of an answer. What he means by I'm confusing axiology, which deals with like the values of things, and deontology, which, like I said here, let me just got to look something up here real quick. Okay, that uses, okay, I don't really want to go through. Okay, the word deontology derives from the Greek for duty and science. Normative theories regarding which. Okay, so yeah, deontology is a normative theory, which I thought it was. The choice is more than required for of what we ought to do. Okay, in contrast to those that guide and assess what kind of person we are and should be. Yeah, I knew that deontology was opposed to consequentialism. Yeah, so deontology would fit within the framework of what I'm speaking of because it's normative. It includes oughts. So it's not. I just do not understand what he means by that objection. I just don't. And I'm not saying anything against Cameron. I'm just saying I genuinely don't know what he was trying to say, what he was trying to convey by saying, yeah, it just seems not relevant. Like he was kind of just saying it just to give something that sounded like an objection.
Saying that axiological properties are deontological properties.
Well, I don't think that there are such things as moral properties to begin with. I wouldn't word it that way, but that's just my own personal view. All I'm really saying is that if there's this greater good, and it's good, so it ought to occur, all things considered, but you have this associated pain with achieving it, that pain ought to occur as well, unless there's other ways that don't include the pain to achieve that greater good. But if there's not, you have to go through the pain to get to that greater good, then it just follows that that pain ought to occur.
Yeah, but that
Unless
doesn't, it
and
just
until
doesn't,
we
I'm
can
not
find
seeing,
alternate
seeing
ways.
why that would entail that it's good.
Because it ought to occur. I don't know if I say that or not. Because
it's
it
like
ought
a
to
rape.
occur.
A
That's what I
rape,
mean.
for example.
Something to be good.
Well, let's
Yeah,
say that
so
there's some sort of justifying
sorry,
good.
my mouse is a little broken. I'm getting a new one in a couple of days here. So it likes to double click. So that's why my screen has been bouncing around a little bit. What it means to say that, like, helping a frail elderly woman across the street is good is just to say that you're obligated to do it. Like you ought to help a frail elderly woman across the street. It's maybe kind of a contrived hypothetical, but you guys get what I'm saying. To say that something is good is to say that it's something that ought to occur, ought to obtain, all things considered. Those mean the same thing. Just like to say that someone is a bachelor is to say that they are an unmarried man. An unmarried man and a bachelor are identical. They're the same thing. What is good and what ought to occur, all things considered, are identical. It's the same thing. It's really just like two different senses of speaking about the same referent, the same thing, the same idea. So that's what I mean when I say that something is good, such that if it's the case that something ought to occur, then that's just a good thing.
For some really terrible thing, like in the case of a rape. Okay, and your claim would be that there is no evil that occurs here because that ought to occur in order to bring about some greater good.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Like maybe
correct.
forgiveness down the line. But that just seems to me to be wild.
If this violation ought to occur, and there's no other way to get to the greater good other than this violation, then yeah, that violation ought to occur. It's good. It's good in virtue of the fact that it's what ought to be done. There's no other way.
Yeah, see, that would be.
I mean, like if aliens came to Earth and said you had to violate this human, or we're going to literally wipe all life. This is extremely contrived. I understand that, but it makes the point. Or otherwise, we're going to wipe all life off the planet.
I just don't see why that would entail that it would be good. It seems to me like that would just be, again, the fact that there's an.
See, I think the problem here is just both Frank and Cameron mean something different when they say it's good. They don't mean that. They don't take those terms to be normative. That's the only thing I can pull from this, is they don't take good and evil to be normative terms. I'm pretty sure almost every moral philosopher generally takes good and evil to be defined normatively. Which sort of means like in terms of oughts, what ought to occur, what ought not to occur, what you should, what you shouldn't do, sort of this evaluation, prescription, that sort of notion.
An evil here, and then there's a good thing that can come about as a result, but that doesn't mean that the evil goes away. I'm still not seeing.
That's because of how I define good. Because what is good is what ought to occur, And if this path is the only way to get to a greater good, if the greater good's a good, it ought to occur, then
so here's
what we have to do to get there ought to occur.
So let me then go back, and Frank, feel free to come back in if you or
No, go ahead, go ahead.
we can also probably wrap things up too here pretty quickly. But okay, so I think again you're kind of mixing up axiology and deontology. So axiology has to do with moral properties such as goodness and wrong, or not wrongness, goodness and bad with moral properties. You're kind of mixing up axiology and deontology. So axiology has to do with moral properties such as goodness and wrong, or not.
No, axiology might apply to that, and axiology certainly applies to morality, because moral evaluations are value. They're axiological. They're rooted in a value of some sort, and value is particularly value determinations and normativity are very closely connected. So axiology deals with like the idea of the concept of value. Is it objective? Is it subjective? I'm trying to think of an easy example here. Is love objectively valuable, or is it only valuable in terms of like a person's stances, like beliefs, desires, aims, or goals, stances? I would take the latter view. So I don't they call that axiarchy? I don't know. Let me look that up here quick. Sorry, I'm looking up all these terms. I should know what they are, but you know what? I don't memorize a lot of stuff. Oh, wait. Okay, what the fuck is this? No, that's not axiarchism. Okay. Just had to check. But yes, axiology deals with value, deontology deals with like normative moral prescriptions or like obligations. I genuinely do not understand what he means when he says that. I really don't.
Not wrongness, goodness and badness, or evil, good and evil. And then deontological properties have to do with moral obligations, stuff like that. And you're kind of mixing the two here. So then I guess one way to kind of maybe clear this up would be to ask you a question like, it's morally good that I become a doctor, but on that basis, am I obligated to then become a doctor? Because that's morally good.
Well, yeah, I would say if you think it's good to become a doctor, then you ought to become a doctor, all things considered. Unless you think that it's good to have a doctor, but there are other reasons that would prevent you from doing so.
Okay. It's also good to kind of do like, what I'm doing here. So, well, then, do you think I'm obligated to be a YouTuber and to be a doctor, or would it be one or the other, or where would you go there?
Do you think that being a YouTuber is a good thing?
Yeah. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it.
Then I think that you ought. I think that you ought to be a YouTuber. That's just what I mean by the word good. Is that it ought. I'll get my camera on here in a second. So the issue here is that really the difference. What's being discussed here is sort of like preference. So I think it's good to be a doctor. I think being a doctor is a good thing. I think one ought to be a doctor. But I think that if you think there are better ways to utilize your skills, then you ought to do that rather than be a doctor, even though a doctor is good, because you can have superlative forms of good, like better or best. So something might be good, but it might not be the best, if you get what I mean. So one could say that, yeah, being a doctor is good, but it's not what's best for me, which would thereby keep one from being a doctor, despite being a doctor being a thing that's good. And I should have explained that here, and I didn't. I kind of had the thought in my mind. I just never really said it or explained it. But that's sort of what Cameron is leading into essentially here. Not that he's leading into it like dishonestly or anything. It's just what the idea that he's leading into with what he's saying is this notion of preference. That there can be things that are good, but there can be things that are better. There can be things that are the best. So just because something is good does not necessarily mean that it's what's preferable, all things considered. To occur, or it ought to be permitted, all things considered. So if I say that eating food is good, all I'm saying is you ought to eat food, all things considered. And when I say something is evil, like shooting another human point blank is evil. I'm just saying that you ought not to shoot another human, all things considered. I take a normative approach
Leo,
with respect to what I mean by good and evil.
by what
Gotcha. Yeah, it
standard
just
are you-
doesn't. I'm not following that
Yeah.
because it just doesn't seem to me like just because something is good, that means that I've got some sort of obligation to do it. Like it's
Mhm.
good to go and watch sunsets. Like that's a good thing. But am I obligated to like just travel around the world to go
Mhm.
view sunsets? I don't think that's right.
So the idea here would be something like, you ought not give somebody your bank PIN to your account, all things considered. But what if somebody came up to you and put a gun to your head and said, if you don't give me what your PIN to your bank account is, I'm going to shoot and kill you? I personally still think that you ought not give the person your bank account, all things considered. Most people would say that that still serves as some sort of like base, but most people are going to give their bank account PIN. Because while it's good to not give your bank account PIN, in the instance where somebody's threatening your life in order to gain that information, it's better to give them your bank PIN. And so you ought to give them your bank PIN, since that's the better option in that instance. I don't know why Cameron and Frank weren't understanding that. So I was just confused a few times in this discussion by their lack of understanding of some of these concepts. It was just a little strange to me.
So I think again you're kind of mixing up axiology and deontology here. But
also
let's let Frank come in and then.
I was just going to say the question we're still grappling with, and Leo, I don't know where you are in terms of Christianity or not, but what is your standard by which you would say we ought to do X rather than Y?
My evaluation based on my stances. So whatever my goals, desires, my aims, my beliefs, those I'm going to use those to evaluate the ways that I should act and behave. And then, at least if I'm rational, I'm going to do what I can genuinely to bring about the content of my goals or my stances. And that's how I believe everyone behaves. I think that's what rational.
But how does that
behavior is.
adjudicate between two different people? Like suppose a Hitler comes over and says, Leo, my goal is to get rid of people like you and people like Frank. So he's going to come and kill us both. Why is he wrong?
Well, I think he's wrong because his stances differ from mine.
It's just different then. So your moral position is whatever you
I'm a moral
individually decide is right. What's that?
I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't think that there are any stance independent normative or moral facts.
Okay, so it wouldn't be morally bad for somebody to murder you then. It would just be.
I think it would be, yes. My stance is informed that's something that one ought not do, all things considered.
Okay, do you believe that premise 2 in your argument is true because it involves evil? Did you mean like not objective evil?
That there are pro-toto evils? Yeah, I think that there are pro-toto evils in the world, like the Holocaust.
But if there are, then you're saying the Holocaust is really wrong and Hitler was wrong and you're right.
Yeah, that's what the state. I should have pressed back when I heard him say really wrong. I didn't actually hear him say, I didn't hear that really there at the time, or wasn't paying attention to it. Because I don't know what it means to say that something, what's the difference between something being wrong and something being really wrong? What did you add by saying it's really wrong? I don't follow. And so like I don't understand that language. It literally just water off a duck's back. It doesn't stick. It just, I don't know. Like what like we say murder is wrong. Murder is really wrong. What did you add other than like an extra word to emphasize that it's wrong? Like it just makes no sense to me. The statement would be according to Christianity, because mind you, the argument from evil is an internal critique on Christianity or Islam, because it can be.
But so you think that premise 2 is false of your argument?
In my actual, it took me a while to realize what Cameron was doing here, but just give it a few seconds. Like independent of the internal critique aspect, I would say no. I think that there are things that are evil, all things considered, like the Holocaust.
Yeah, well, no, you're just in reality, you just think the premise is false.
No.
Like you think premise 2 that there is pro-toto evil, you think that premise is false.
No, I don't. No, I think that premise is true. I think that there are proto evils in the world.
Oh, well, but you don't believe in objective evil?
See, he thinks in order to say that something is evil, all things considered, you have to have some object. It's the whole you have to have some objective standard. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. That's correct. I don't need to believe in objective evil to believe that there are things that you ought not do, all things considered.
Well, how can there be? Those two things don't go together. In order for you to say that there really is objective evil in the world, you have to believe in objective evil, but you're saying you don't.
Well, because the argument is an internal critique of Christianity, and Christians believe in objective morality, so the argument assumes that.
Right, but if
I don't believe in objective morality. Yeah, this is strange. I don't think either one of them really caught on to the idea of what an internal critique is, like what an internal critique is supposed to be. It's saying, okay, let's assume that you're correct here. If we do, here are some either like internal inconsistencies or straight up internal contradictions I can draw from your worldview. It's sort of like a reductio ad absurdum. If we assume that your view is correct, we can derive various inconsistencies or contradictions in it that show that it must actually be false, and therefore we can reject your view. It's an internal critique. I am still genuinely surprised that Frank and Cam apparently did not catch on to what an internal critique is. But again, it doesn't matter what I believe, because the argument is an internal critique on Christianity.
Right, but it doesn't work internally on Christianity, because in order for objective evil to exist, God has to exist, because he is the standard.
But then the question would be, if it's an internal critique, like why would a Christian accept premise 2?
Why would a Christian accept premise 2? Because they think that there are evil things in the world. Like actually evil things in the world. Okay. Dude, you don't think that there are
right?
things,
because this is not
there are things that are evil in the world?
Well, I do. I mean, I don't accept your view that if you've got a justifying good, then it means that there is no evil. I don't accept that. But the question is, because you're framing this as an internal critique, right? Something that Christians internally think, right? Because I mean, I think that you reject premise 2 just because you don't believe that evil is objective. So
again, he's saying that he's effectively stating, in order for something to be evil, all things considered, there has to be some objective standard. No, there doesn't. And I don't think that Cameron could give a decent argument that there has to be.
Reject
I don't
it, you think that Christians,
there are pro-toto evils.
That's fine. But you think that Christians, should accept it. This is an internal critique for Christians. So you think that Christians should accept it. But then the question is, why should a Christian accept premise 2?
Because they believe that there are pro-toto evils, I would assume.
Why would they think that?
Because they think God is real and grounds morality.
But why would they think that there's pro-toto evils?
Because God is real and grounds morality. They believe in an objective morality. Unless you think that there are things that are evil, but they're not evil, all things considered.
Well, I mean, if we were to take your definition of evil, which I think again is maybe the incorrect way to view it. If we take that, it doesn't seem like a Christian would have reason to adopt that premise.
You don't think that things that are evil are things that oughtn't occur?
No, I mean, on your definition, right? If something has a justifying reason, then it's not evil, right? So Christians would just say that the evils in the world have some sort of justifying reason.
Yeah, and then therefore the Christian thinks that we live in a perfect world. There is no evil in the world.
Well, it depends on what you mean by perfect, but they would just...
I didn't get a chance to define that, but I want to do it here. When I talk about like the best of all possible worlds or the perfect world, I mean a world in which all things which ought to occur, all things considered, do, and all those things which ought not to occur, all things considered, never do. And I think that's pretty... I would say... excuse me. I would say that seems to be satisfactory. I don't know why it wouldn't be. If somebody's got an argument, I'm very much open to hearing it.
They would just think that there is no pro-total evil on your definition. So yeah, it just doesn't seem like it works as an internal
conclusions. is that you either reject the existence of God or you acknowledge that there are no evils in the world. But for the Christian, that's still going to be problematic, because then why Jesus? If
Well,
nothing's real,
they wouldn't necessarily accept that there's no evil. They would just accept that there's no such thing as what you're calling pro-toto evil.
Something that ought not to occur, all things considered.
Yeah.
Do you think the Holocaust ought not to have occurred, all things considered, as a Christian?
Of course, it ought not have occurred if we're following the commands of God, but it did occur because
but ought not have occurred, all things considered.
What does all things considered mean?
That means that when we consider... Now, notice that when I originally gave this argument, I think I defined, or earlier, I think I defined what I meant by all things considered, but maybe I didn't. I'm pretty sure I did, though. Consider all possible relevant facts surrounding the Holocaust, that based on those, there is nothing that justifies this event occurring, that it ought not to have occurred when we consider, even when we consider all possible relevant facts.
Yeah, see, I think that's the hang up, is that you're again conflating axiology with deontology. So
and we don't have
what you're really saying is that there's no
value. I still don't. Yeah, I don't know what Cameron means when he says that. I just don't get it in here.
Well, really, that's what evil means. Evil is an axiological property, but you're conflating it with deontology.
Well, I don't think it's a property.
But what's happening is that really you're just saying, you're asking a question, does the Holocaust have some sort of justifying reason? And I think every Christian,
I don't think it does.
Maybe I'll back up on that. I think most Christians would
most
just accept
people
that
don't think it does.
There is a justifying reason for it. So if that's what it comes down to, it just doesn't. I mean, it really is just another version of the problem of evil.
So then it oughtn't. It ought to have occurred, is what you're saying. The Holocaust ought to have occurred.
No, it was allowed to.
I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means to say that it's justified if it oughtn't to.
Well, it's because you're switching the language.
Yeah.
You're switching axiology and deontology.
It morally ought not have occurred.
I still don't know what you mean when you say that. I mean, I'm using these terms as they're used standardly in moral philosophy, and I've had professional moral philosophers tell me that.
Okay, it doesn't seem to be that way. I mean, maybe I'm the one that's wrong with it. I think so. Happy to be proven wrong about this, but I mean, evil or good and bad are axiological properties. Right and wrongness are deontological.
I can accept
properties.
that. Yeah.
And deontological properties have to do with oughts, obligations. It ought not to have occurred.
Yeah.
So whether or not something is good or bad is separate. Yeah, well,
normative ethics is dealing with these oughts and ought-nots, because that's like when you think normativity, think oughts, think evaluation. That's sort of what that.
Yeah, but really, what you're getting down to is you're saying, does this evil have a justifying reason for it? And then you're saying, well, then it shouldn't have. It ought not to have occurred. But that doesn't follow, at least on my view. Like, it doesn't follow that just because something has a justifying good, that it ought not to have occurred.
Well, then it just sounds like Cameron's worldview is one that doesn't include logic. If Y is good, by which we mean it ought to occur, all things considered, and X is necessary for the conduction of Y, then it follows that X ought to occur, all things considered, such as in virtue of the fact that Y ought to occur, all things considered. And in order to get Y, you necessarily need X, then X is good. So if Y is good and X necessarily conduces Y, then it follows that X is good. What do you think it means to justify something that would otherwise be considered morally evil?
Sorry, when you asked that question, my immediate thought was, we're going so long. We're going like it's 3.
Yeah.
No, notice his reaction to that question. Why be considered morally evil? What do you?
Just because something has a justifying good, that it ought not to have occurred.
What do you think it means to justify something that would otherwise be considered morally evil?
Sorry, when you asked that question, my immediate thought was, we're going so long. We're going.
That was the question to ask. I should have asked it earlier, because I feel like, look, I could be wrong. I'm not in Cam's head, but I feel like that's the moment he realized that his answer was going to be the same as the way that I described it earlier, where when to say that we're morally justifying an action is to say that this action is one that otherwise ought not to occur, but that in virtue of this justifying reason, it actually ought to occur. And then that just means that since it's something that ought to occur, all things considered, it's just something which is good, and so isn't actually an evil thing. And so this is sort
We're
of
going
where the
like
discussion ends.
it's 3.
Yeah.
We're over 3 hours,
just
so we
keep
do
digging
actually need
And that's kind of why I laughed there, because where this discussion ends on me asking that question.
to wrap it up. We could go deeper. We could go deeper and have more back and
Look,
forth. And this would actually be good. Like,
let me just say the bigger issue here, Leo, that I'm concerned about with regard to what you've said is that you know with more certainty that the Holocaust was objectively wrong than you know that atheism is true.
Well, I
So
don't think
why-
Holocaust was objectively wrong. I think it was just wrong, all things considered.
What's the difference between that and objectively wrong?
That the wrongness of the Holocaust holds independently of my evaluations of it, which I don't think is true.
Well, if you know that's false, what you just told me.
No, I
You
don't
know
think
in your
that's
heart
false.
that's false. You know the Holocaust was wrong, regardless of what people think about it. I'm sorry, I'm not going to play the game anymore.
I'm not
You
going to
know
play the
there are
game
people that
anymore.
think it
As
wasn't
if I'm
wrong.
playing some game instead of just describing my position as a moral anti-realist. I just think that's funny. There's just more of us that disagree with them. So, I mean, I think morality is intersubjective, but I don't think it's objective. I think that the concept of moral realism is incoherent to me, if you want me to be completely honest.
No,
And
it's
I'm
not
not alone when I say
incoherent.
that.
What's incoherent is somebody saying that the Holocaust was just a matter of opinion.
I didn't say
I
that.
didn't say that.
I said that it's wrong according to
What you
my
said.
stances. No,
All right.
I said it's wrong according to my stances and the way that I evaluate them, which
Okay,
it
that's
is.
just your opinion then. That's just your opinion. You're not saying it's
I don't
really
think
wrong.
that's
It's
really an
your
opinion.
opinion.
I don't know what it means to say
Okay.
really wrong.
Look,
But even if it
All right,
was,
Leah,
most people's opinions agree with me, so it's not like it's really a big deal.
most people think the Holocaust wasn't objectively wrong. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that even if it was an opinion that the Holocaust was wrong, most people would hold that opinion.
All right, you lost me, but that's
Yeah, because Frank doesn't understand counterfactuals, I guess.
okay. It's almost 3.5 hours
All right, I should actually say counter possible.
doing this. Hey, Cameron, let me say something here. Thank you, Leo. Thanks for the conversation.
Mhm.
Cameron,
Thank you, guys.
only
All right,
video,
Leo.
there's only been 2 videos on our YouTube channel, which has over
what Frank
2,100
says here is kind of
videos.
fucked up.
No, 2,100 videos.
Oh,
We'll get to it.
Out of 2,100 videos on our YouTube channel, only 2 were taken down. One of them was we had a video.
And this part was pointed out to me by Nitty, because once I left, I didn't continue listening to the actual live stream. So I didn't know that this was said until Nitty pointed it out to me.
From caseforlife.com, which
It's kind of fucked up, though.
showed
as you'll see.
abortion in all 3 trimesters. And that was just too much truth for YouTube to handle. The second video that was taken down, actually, this one was taken down first, was when I had a debate with David Silverman, who at the time was the president of the American Atheists, Jewish by ethnicity. And during the debate, does God exist? Or what best explains reality, atheism or theism? I said, if there is no God, the Holocaust wasn't really wrong. And he tried to avoid that for at least 7 or 8 minutes until I finally pinned him down and he said, you know what, Frank, you're right. The Holocaust wasn't really wrong. And YouTube took it down because he's a Holocaust denier. All right. I don't know what's going to happen to this video, but we just had a gentleman on here trying to say the Holocaust wasn't really objectively wrong. Now,
listen to the way. So it is technically true that I said it's not objectively wrong. But listen to the way that he's framing this whole thing. He's effectively trying to frame it as that I'm a Holocaust denier. When I think, of course, I think it's wrong. The Holocaust is wrong. But I don't think that the truth of that statement is independent of me thinking it. And the funny thing is that most people think exactly what I do. So I'm really not concerned about it. He just doesn't understand the difference between moral realism and moral anti-realism. He doesn't really grasp the difference, because professional philosophers aren't going to say that a moral anti-realist, like, oh, well, you don't think the Holocaust is really wrong. That's not how they're really going to approach that. So while it's not technically wrong what Frank said, it's about the way that he's framing the situation.
Everybody watching here knows that that is false. The Holocaust was objectively morally wrong.
Anyway, that covers all of that discussion. I just wanted to go over that again, explain things out a little bit, kind of review it, because in that discussion, as you've seen now, there were a couple points where I didn't really get to respond to something that Frank said or explain out an idea as much as I wanted to. And I get it. They had been going for a while. I very much understand that, you know, sort of like this like streaming fatigue, sort of, you know. So that's all I wanted to cover. If you guys want to see it completely uninterrupted, it is on Cameron's channel, Capturing Christianity. I'm the last guest that appears on the stream, so you can go there and kind of scrub to the timestamp and see the whole uninterrupted thing if you'd like to. But that's all I have for you on this wonderful Saturday evening. And with that, I'm going to let you guys continue to enjoy it.